Welcome back to the Basics of Neuroscience course. In this lecture, we're going to delve into the first system, which is the somatosensory system. So basically from this point on, we're going to really start to dive deeper into the higher functions of the brain, how the brain is really able to produce meaningful behavior and respond to the environment. Now, before we do so, you need to become familiar with the major brain regions and how the brain is divided into parts. So there are 4 brain lobes: the frontal lobe that is just behind the eyes and the nose, the parietal lobe that is behind the frontal lobe or posterior to it, the temporal lobe that is underneath the frontal and parietal lobes and sits next to the ear, and the occipital lobe, which is the smallest one, and it is found at the back of the head. Now there's also the brain stem, which is really what we refer to as the primitive part of the brain because it is present in lower species and is responsible for very basic or primitive functions. Now, from top to bottom, the brain stem, consists of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. Now, attached to the back of the brain stem is the cerebellum, and this is a compact structure with really important functions. Now, if we look at the functions that are performed by each, just please note that a lot of the functions, especially the more complex ones like learning and memory, really require the cooperation between different areas. So it's not always clear-cut as to who does what, but this is just in general. So as I mentioned, the brainstem is responsible for the primitive functions, including all of those things that are just required for our survival, like breathing. So it also regulates the heart rate, the blood pressure, and other types of parameters that should remain at certain set points, or they can change depending on the requirements. Now, the cerebellum is very important for coordination, for balance, and motor learning. So an example of motor learning is riding a bike. So the cerebellum is required for something like that. The cerebellum also ensures that our movements are fluid and coordinated rather than disjointed. Now, the temporal lobe is important for processing what we hear, or auditory processing, and it also plays a major role in memory and emotion. The occipital lobe is responsible for visual processing. The parietal lobe is involved in integrating different types of sensory information that come in from other areas. It is also important for attention and spatial information. Finally, the frontal lobe is considered to be where our personality lies. So it is required for complex cognitive functions such as reasoning and problem solving. So as I mentioned, the first system we're going to go through is the somatosensory system. So this is the system that is responsible for processing different sensations in the environment and to help us understand the environment. So things such as touch in addition to internal sensations. So before we delve in, we have to distinguish between sensation and perception when it comes to sensory systems. So sensation is the actual information that is received from sensory receptors, while perception refers to the conscious experience of that sensation. So not all sensations are conscious. For example, we don't really perceive sensations of our internal organs unless the sensation reaches pain, and in that case we have a conscious experience of pain in the gut, for example. But for us to perceive a sensation, there is a higher order processing that has to take place in the brain in order to bring the sensation into our consciousness so that we can perceive it. Now, one interesting feature of the somatosensory system is that the different parts of the body are mapped topographically onto the cortex. So the somatosensory cortex here, as we can see in the diagram, is found at the anterior part of the parietal lobe. As you can see from the map on the right, information from the lower parts of the body, like the legs, arrives to the inner parts of the cortex, while information from the upper parts, like the face, come into the outermost part of the cortex. In addition, the larger the body part is in this map, that means there are more receptors for it, and therefore there is more space dedicated to it in the cortex. The fingers and the face, for example, are much more sensitive and more highly innervated than the legs. So one very important structure in the somatosensory pathway that you have to become familiar with is the thalamus. So this is a structure that's found in the part of the brain called the diencephalon, along with the hypothalamus that is involved in hormone release. So the thalamus is thought of as the relay station of the brain. It has many connections to and from the cortex, and it basically decides which information gets through to the cortex. So it acts like a gatekeeper. It keeps irrelevant information out of our consciousness. And actually, all of the sensory systems pass through the thalamus, not just the somatosensory system, all of them, including hearing, vision, everything except smell. This is what a pathway looks like, a typical pathway in the somatosensory system. It consists of 3 neurons. So the first neuron is the sensory neuron, whose sensory receptor is stimulated in the skin, for example, and then its axon extends into the spinal cord and synapses onto an interneuron. Now this interneuron's axon is going to cross to the other side, or what we call the contralateral side, and then it will ascend through the spinal cord all the way to the brain, and it will synapse on a neuron in the thalamus. Now this third neuron will ascend to the appropriate part of the somatosensory cortex, depending on which part of the body the message is coming from. So here you can notice that information from one side of the body is processed by the opposite side of the brain. So an injury to the somatosensory cortex, for example, on the left side of the brain, is going to lead to a loss of feeling on the right side of the body. Now this is a concept that will come up a lot in the different systems, and it is due to this crossing of the second neuron, or the interneuron, in the spinal cord. So what kind of information does the somatosensory system actually process? So it can process information from our physical environment, like on our skin. It can also process internal information about our organs through the receptors that are found there. Finally, it can process information related to proprioception. So proprioception is something you can think of as the awareness of the body's position in space. It's a sense that is also involved with balance and coordination, so it is also dependent on the cerebellum. In the somatosensory pathway, we saw that the first neuron is the sensory neuron that has a receptor in the skin, for instance. Now, there are different receptors for different sensations that can be transmitted, such as pressure or temperature. So here are a few of those receptors, and their shape varies based on the kind of stimulus that they respond to. We can divide the receptors into those that are encapsulated, so they're surrounded by a sort of disc or a sac, versus those that are simply free or have naked nerve endings. So the encapsulated receptors are the ones here in the diagram on the left, and they are the mechanoreceptors. So these are receptors that respond to touch, pressure, stretching, vibration. They each have specific names and appearances. So here in the diagram, so some of these are Ruffini endings, Meissner's or Pacinian corpuscles, Merkel discs. Some of these are found more superficially in the skin, while others are deeper. Now, all of these receptors work together in order to help us to handle and feel different objects, for instance. Now, on the other hand, free nerve endings respond to pain or temperature. So these are respectively nociceptors and thermoreceptors. Other than these receptors that are found in the skin that we usually have a conscious perception of, there are also receptors that are found internally that transmit information about our muscles and joints, and they contribute to proprioception. So proprioceptors are also considered mechanoreceptors since they respond to mechanical forces such as stretch. Muscle spindles are found within the muscles, so as you can see in the diagram on the left, and they monitor basically the length of the muscle in order to detect any excessive stretching, for example. Now, Golgi tendon organs are receptors that are found within the tendons, so these are basically the tendon, it attaches the muscles to the bones, and the Golgi tendon organs will sense tension and force. In the diagram on the right, we can see joint receptors, which are basically found in the connective tissue surrounding a joint, and the joint receptors transmit information about the position and movement of the joint in addition to stretching. There are also differences in the axons of these sensory neurons. So each type of receptor has a different axon diameter and thickness of the myelin that is wrapped around the axon, and both of these factors influence the speed of conduction in a direct way. So proprioreceptors have the widest axons and the thickest myelination sheath, so they conduct impulses the fastest, which is important and kind of logical since these receptors really have to be firing practically all the time since they send information about the position and the status of the body's muscles, tendons, and joints. Mechanoreceptors have axons with an intermediate diameter and they are well myelinated. Nociceptors, which transmit pain, have the thinnest axon diameters and some of them have a very thin layer of myelin while others are not myelinated at all, so the nociceptors have relatively slow impulse conduction. Now I would like to go over some key concepts about how sensory information is understood by the brain. Since we already know that the amplitude of an action potential is always the same, there has to be another way in which the brain can get information about how intense a certain stimulus is, since this is important to produce an appropriate response. We need to be able to distinguish, we need to be able to tell the difference between extreme pressure exerted by something heavy on our hand, for example, versus very light pressure exerted by a paper. So actually the intensity of a stimulus is encoded by the frequency of action potentials. So the more back-to-back action potentials that there are over a short period of time, the more intense the stimulus is. So one way in which this happens is that when a stimulus is more intense, it can start to activate more receptors that are found adjacent to each other. This phenomenon is called recruitment. So basically the brain will receive the same message from a bunch of different cells. In addition, the receptors are going to transform the physical information they receive into electrical signals, and this process is called sensory transduction. So this will result in a type of graded potential, which, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, is just a small change in membrane potential, and it's called a receptor potential. Now, another important concept that you should know about the somatosensory system is that each receptor has what's called a receptive field. So this is just the area in which any stimulation will cause a response from this neuron. So if you stimulate within this field, then you will get a response. If you stimulate outside of this field, you won't expect a response. Now, as we saw before in the map of the different body parts on the somatosensory cortex, some parts are more highly innervated than others. So to test these differences, we can conduct what's called a two-point discrimination test. In this test, the goal is to see whether a person can perceive two very close points as two individual points rather than one, using, for example, a narrow pair of forceps. You would immediately notice that it is easy to feel two individual pricks on the fingers, but on the shoulder or the back, it's more likely that you would only perceive one prick. This is because the distance between the two arms of the forceps are too close to each other that you cannot tell them apart. This is based on the sensitivity of that specific body part and the number of sensory receptors that are found there. If there aren't many receptors in that area, then the forceps are only going to activate one receptor rather than two adjacent receptors, so there's only one message and therefore a perception of only one stimulus. This is an image of what is known as the sensory homunculus. It's a famous depiction of a human where each body part's size reflects how much space is dedicated to that body part in the somatosensory cortex. So that's why the hands and the mouth are disproportionately large compared to the rest of the body. This homunculus can provide great hints as to which body parts would be more sensitive in the two-point discrimination test. Now, one thing that the nervous system really doesn't like to do is waste time or energy on information that is not important. So sensory neurons can do something called adaptation. If a stimulus is sustained, the neuron will adapt, either quickly or slowly, so it will no longer fire in response to the said stimulus. For example, if you pick up a key and then you keep it in the palm of your hand, the neurons may go crazy at first when you first pick it up in order to try to help the brain understand what kind of object you're touching and what it feels like. But then if you just keep it in your palm, its constant presence is no longer important. So there's no need for the neuron to keep firing with the message that there is still something in your palm. So adaptation can help a sensory neuron to only respond to changes, for instance, like when you pick up the key or put it down, but not when it's just sitting in your palm. The motor system consists of many structures throughout the central nervous system. Now, some of them are main structures that are crucial for motor function and producing motor output, while others just serve as more of accessory structures that will just contribute to the main output. These structures include the motor cortex, the cerebellum, the basal ganglia, the brainstem, and the spinal cord. Motor neurons are really at the center of the motor system, and we can divide them into two categories: the upper or lower motor neurons. The upper motor neurons are usually in the cortex or the brainstem, and they will activate lower motor neurons. They initiate the motor program. Now, the lower motor neurons, which are found usually in the brainstem or the spinal cord, will be the ones to actually synapse onto a muscle fiber and either activate it in order to cause contraction and therefore movement, or to inhibit its activity to prevent contraction. So the structures and the circuits that are activated in the motor system depend on the type of movement that we want to produce, specifically whether the movement is voluntary or involuntary, like in the case of a reflex. There are many differences between these two. So in terms of structures that are involved, because voluntary movement arises from consciousness and higher order thinking, it requires the cortex. However, reflexes do not require consciousness, so they typically arise from lower order structures like the brainstem or even the spinal cord. Voluntary movement can be generated internally, for example, secondary to a desire to do something, while reflexes are always generated in response to a specific type of stimulus. Voluntary movement is also highly variable, as we would expect, since it really changes depending on what you would like to do. For example, you can move your arm to the side, to the back, forward, you can rotate it, you can shake it, but reflexes are really stereotyped. So for example, when the doctor taps your knee, your leg is always going to jerk forward. There's no other way that reflex will happen. It never goes to the side, it never goes backward. So it's the same movement that always occurs. A final point to make is that unlike reflexes, voluntary movements can be affected by learning and practice. Again, a reflex is always the same, so there's no performance quality there. But for example, the way you do a backflip the first time you try it is going to be very different from the way you're going to do it after you practice for a couple of months. So in this case, involuntary movement, practice can really affect your performance since there can be motor learning. Now, the motor cortex is where voluntary movements will arise. It is found in the frontal lobe, just anterior to the somatosensory cortex. And like the somatosensory cortex, it is also topographically organized. So the lower parts of the body are innervated by the middle inner parts of the cortex, and then the upper parts of the body are innervated by the outer parts of the cortex. And again, we can see the same thing we saw with the somatosensory cortex, which is that the hands and the face are more highly innervated than other parts of the body, as we can see from the space that they occupy in the cortex. The basal ganglia, this is another important component of the motor system. So these we haven't seen before because they're found deep within the brain. These are a distinct cluster of nuclei, which is a cluster of cells, and they're found basically near the thalamus and the ventricles. So the basal ganglia consist of three structures: the caudate, the putamen, and the globus pallidus, which is divided into an internal and an external component. So as we said, these are the four main structures that are involved. Now, these are the actual functional contributions of each structure to the motor system. The motor cortex is the center, since it is responsible for planning, initiating, and directing voluntary movement. The brainstem helps to regulate posture, which is mostly subconscious, and basic movements that don't really require extensive planning, so more for reflexes. The basal ganglia are involved in fine-tuning and regulation of movement, but more recent research has actually started to uncover more interesting roles for the basal ganglia, such as motor learning. So the basal ganglia are still more or less a mystery. There is still a lot more that we need to discover about their role in the motor system. And finally, the cerebellum is important for coordination and ensuring that movements are fluid and balanced. Now we can move to the actual motor neurons themselves. First, it is important to understand how the motor neurons and the muscle fibers are organized. So in this diagram of the spinal cord, we can see different motor neurons, specifically lower motor neurons, and the muscle fibers that they innervate. So one muscle is controlled by various motor neurons, since each individual muscle fiber in the muscle can have a different motor neuron innervating it. So to simplify this, the term motor unit represents a motor neuron and all the muscle fibers it innervates. So in this one muscle we're looking at, there are actually 3 motor units. The reason behind this organization is actually in order to allow for more specific and detailed control and regulation of a muscle. So if the entire muscle represents one motor unit, meaning that it is innervated by only one motor neuron, then as you can imagine, when the motor neuron is activated, the entire muscle would contract. So there would be no variation in the intensity of the contraction, so the muscle would quickly get tired. It would be either an all or none kind of movement. However, because there are actually multiple motor units, then the muscle can be activated just a little bit or moderately or completely, depending on the requirement of the context. So this is particularly helpful if we consider something like a marathon run. So it allows the brain to really have better control over the muscle to be efficient and effective in its response. And then one last point I want to make here is that the specific area where we see the motor neurons here in the spinal cord is called the ventral horn. This is important because we're going to talk about that in the next slide. So since the lower motor neurons are mostly found in the spinal cord, all of the different neurons are arranged in a specific way. So here are examples of what the spinal cord looks like at different segments throughout the body. So the top part that is just underneath the skull is referred to as the cervical spinal cord, and all the axons of the motor neurons that innervate muscles in the arms and hands will exit around this segment. So we can see that the ventral part of the spinal cord, or the ventral horn specifically, is relatively wide here. Now, if we compare this to the ventral horn in the thoracic spinal cord, we can really see the difference. So because there are very few muscles around the thorax, there aren't that many motor neurons at these segments. So the ventral horn is much, much smaller. However, when we move down to the lumbar regions, which is around the hips and the legs, this is where all the motor neurons that innervate the hip, the leg, and the foot muscles are found. So the ventral horn in the lumbar segments is basically the largest between all the spinal cord segments. Now, within the ventral horn itself, there's also a specific type of topographic or organization. So here we basically imagine it as if there's an arm, basically from the shoulder to the fingertips, superimposed onto the ventral horn. So what this means is that the more proximal arm muscles, so the ones that are closer to the shoulder, are controlled by motor neurons that are found more medially, which means towards the midline of the body, while the arm muscles that are located more distally or farther away from the shoulder, like the ones in the forearms or the fingers, are controlled by motor neurons on the lateral, so the outer parts of the ventral horn, exactly how we see it in the diagram. The synapse between the motor neuron and a muscle is particular, and therefore it has its own name and characteristics that we can examine. So the synapse is called the neuromuscular junction, and it can activate contraction in the postsynaptic muscle fiber through the release of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, which binds to its receptor on the muscle fiber in order to open sodium channels and trigger a contraction in the muscle. This signal is typically terminated via the action of an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase, which will break down acetylcholine into non-active subunits that can then be reabsorbed by the neuron in order to make new acetylcholine molecules. Now, at the synapse, muscle force, or the strength of the contraction that results, is going to be regulated by various factors. One of them that we already saw is the activation of different motor units. So the more motor neurons that are activating the muscle fibers, so at the neuromuscular junction, then the more muscle fibers are activated, so the stronger the force of the muscle contraction that is produced, since more muscle fibers are contracting at the same time. If the force is not sufficient to execute the required movement, for example, then we have what is called recruitment, which means that more motor units are going to be activated. So more motor neurons will start to be added. And then finally, one important special feature about the neuromuscular junction is that if we have back-to-back action potentials without muscle relaxation in between, we'll have summation in such a way that the muscle is going to actually be in what we call tetanus, which means it is in constant contraction. So the higher the frequency of action potentials, then the higher the chances that the potentials are going to fuse, and this results in tetanus. There are many important involuntary reflexes that are important to know in the motor system. So there are reflexes we have all experienced, and once you understand how one example works, then it becomes really easy to understand all reflexes, since there are actually really similar concepts across different reflexes. So this reflex is called the flexion cross extension reflex, and it's really important for maintaining proper balance during walking, for example, but also for dangerous situations like we see in the diagram, which is when we have to react quickly when we step on something sharp. So as you can see, the circuit is completely within the spinal cord. So it is a really rapid reflex, since it does not require the brain to process any of this information. So the stimulus is when a sensory receptor in the foot detects that we have stepped on something painful, and this is in the right foot, and it carries this message to interneurons in the spinal cord that will activate numerous circuits. So first, a motor neuron in the ventral horn that synapses on the flexor muscles at the back of the right leg is going to be activated to cause these muscles to contract in order to flex the leg backward and pull the foot up and away from the painful stimulus. That's the priority. At the same time, motor neurons on the opposite side, or the contralateral side, are activated so that they can stimulate extensor muscles on the front of the left leg to contract, and therefore the left leg becomes stiff and straight in order to support the weight of the body, since the right leg is no longer on the floor. Another common reflex is reciprocal inhibition, and this can be seen during a basic physical examination when a doctor taps at a specific point on the knee and you notice that the lower leg immediately goes forward. Here, what's activated is the tendon stretch receptors that are found in the knee, and they in turn activate motor neurons also in the spinal cord, and this will lead to contraction of the quadriceps muscle on the front of the leg, and therefore the leg swings forward. At the same time, the receptor neurons activate interneurons that will inhibit the motor neuron that activates the hamstring muscle, which is found at the back of the same leg. So this is a common feature in many reflexes. When we activate one muscle, we don't want the opposing or antagonistic muscle to be activated at the same time. Otherwise, there would be no movement, or even worse, there could be an injury due to opposing forces occurring at the same time. So very often, when one muscle is activated, the antagonistic muscle is inhibited at the same time. Finally, walking or locomotion is a type of movement we execute without even thinking about it, yet it is rather complex if we think about it internally. In mammals, there are clusters of cells that are called central pattern generators, and they're found in the spinal cord. So they integrate input from centers in the brainstem that play a role in locomotion, and then they produce appropriate timing, coordination, and adjustment of this type of rhythmic movement. However, in its essence, locomotion is basically repetitive cycles of flexion and extension that is similar to what we saw in the reflex of the crossed flexion and extension. So if we watch a video of someone walking in slow motion, you would notice that one leg has to extend in order to support the weight of the body, while the other is flexed and in the air. And then when that leg hits the floor, it is then extended in order to allow the opposite leg to flex and now be in the air, and this keeps repeating on and on. Of course, this is a non-conscious movement since it almost completely occurs within the spinal cord through these specialized central pattern generators.